When I was in my early 20s, I was terrible with money. I was always broke and my credit was awful. I think at one point I checked my credit and it was in the 400s. And now I'm almost 40. I have excellent credit in the 800s. I have money saved up and I have done well for myself. And it's a big change from the person I was almost 20 years ago. And that got me thinking about advice I would give my 20-year-old self if I could go back and help myself not be broke anymore. So that's why I wanted to make this video. It's going to be titled How to Not Be Broke When You're 20, or How to Stop Being Broke When You're 20. I don't know, working title, but let me get into it right now. The first thing I would tell myself to do if I was 20 years old and broke is to figure out what the hell I'm doing with all my money. And in order to do that, the first thing I would do is track all my spending. Literally write down every single dollar that I spend, all the money that goes out and all the money that comes in, and figure out like why I'm spending money in certain places. I would tell myself to at least do that for a solid 2 weeks and maybe even a month. That way I can really get a gauge for what I'm spending my money on for a whole month, because that would account for all my monthly bills and my daily spending and my weekly spending. And then once I do all that, I would create a budget and I'll figure out what my necessities are and where I really need to spend money. And I'll start to be able to figure out where I'm just kind of wasting money and the things that aren't that important. I know when I was younger, I spent a lot of my money on video games, alcohol, weed, clothes, going out with my friends and gambling and partying and just completely just wasting all my money. I never focused on getting my spending under control and I never paid attention to where my money was going. It's funny now because when I really try to think about it, I can kind of pinpoint where I would spend a lot of my money and why I probably had money problems. But at the time, it was just fun to spend money. When you're 20 and you're trying to have a good time, you don't really care if you spend money. But when you get older, you start to realize how much of a waste of money that was and how much further ahead in life you could probably be if you didn't waste all that money. So the first thing I would tell myself in order to not waste money as much and be broke is to track my spending and figure out a budget. And remember, that budget should be realistic. You should know how much money you bring in after you've tracked it for a whole month. And then you should really account for all the necessities like your rent, your utility, your groceries, and the things that you really, really need. And then see how much money you have left over. And then you can start thinking about some of the other things I'm going to talk about right now. So by doing that budget and by tracking your spending, you'll be able to start figuring out where you can cut back on some of your expenses. Like I mentioned, a lot of my money just went to bullshit, to stuff that I shouldn't have been spending money on in the first place. And it's also why my credit kind of got ruined, because when I did get credit cards, I was terrible with them. And I bought a whole bunch of junk and shoes and games and things that I ended up ruining my credit over, which is so stupid to look back at now, and how much I struggled to fix my credit, which I'll talk about a little bit later on in this video. But I will say that I wish I would have thought about that stuff a little bit more when I was doing it, because that would have really helped me kind of get my finances in order. And I didn't do that until I was in my 30s, which shame on me. Hopefully you don't do the same. But if I would have tracked my finances and had a budget, I would have known where I could have reduced my expenses, and I would have cut back on a lot of the unnecessary spending that I did. And that's going to be like my big tip for reducing your expenses, is make sure that you cut back on the unnecessary spending that you do. And you hear that cliche thing where people tell you, oh, don't spend $5 on a cup of coffee every day, and don't go out and spend money that you don't have, and make sure that you're accounting for all the things that you need to pay for before you go out and buy things that you don't need. That's easier said than done, especially when you're young and you want to buy stuff. You want to keep up with the Joneses more. And that does happen a lot when you're in your early 20s. I know how difficult that can be to balance and to figure out. But if you don't want to be broke when you're young and you want to get ahead by the time you're 30 and in your 40s, and if you are broke right now in your 20s, you really got to cut back on that unnecessary spending. And if that does mean that you can't enjoy a $5 cup of coffee every day, well, that's just the reality of it. I don't ever go to Starbucks. Even now, I drink black coffee at home. I buy cheap coffee. I don't drink anything fancy because it's a waste of money. And even if I had a lot of money, I don't think I would go out and buy coffee every day, because it's just something that I don't find worthy of my money. And the next thing I would say is, when you cut back on your unnecessary spending, but you do want to buy some things because you need them, try to find cheaper alternatives to the stuff that you're going out and buying. I know this is hard, and it goes back to the keeping up with the Joneses stuff, because we live in a very consumeristic society and we often feel like we need the very best things. I'm kind of guilty of this myself now, but I make sure that when I purchase things that are a little bit more expensive, they're kind of buy it for life type items or things that I know that I'm going to have for a really long time. And it's not something that I would need to upgrade or replace frequently. For instance, some of the stuff that I spend a little bit more on are my backpacks and my travel gear that I have for all my cameras and things like that. Now, mind you, the cameras and stuff are a business expense because of my YouTube channel, and so are my backpacks. I prefer to have a good backpack that'll last me a really, really long time than to buy a cheaper one that'll fall apart and need to be replaced. Also, the backpacks that I buy are Peak Design and they have a lifetime warranty. So if anything happens to them, I can get them fixed or replaced and not have to worry about it. So that's a big plus. So you should really think about where you can find cheaper alternatives. And if you do plan on spending a little bit extra on something, try to find things that are kind of buy it for life items and try to buy things that will last a very long time if you do decide to spend a little bit more. Don't jump on trends. Don't spend a bunch of money on like sneakers and clothes that goes out of style that by next year you're going to feel like, oh, that's last year's item. I don't want to wear those. Oh, those shoes are old. I don't want to wear those. I know when I was younger, I used to buy sneakers and stuff like that, which kind of silly now when I think about it because I only own like one pair of sneakers now, but back then I used to have like 10 pairs of sneakers, and it was stupid how I wanted to dress to impress, but I was broke. And that's something that you should kind of think about. If you really don't have a lot of money, try to buy stuff that's nice, but cut the cost where you can and spend a little bit more on items that will last you a very long time. And that's something to consider when you're trying to dial back your expenses and cut back on your spending a little bit. You can always try to find cheaper alternatives for stuff rather than buying the best, latest, and greatest item. The next thing I'm going to say is figure out a way to increase your income. This is something that I actually did, but I was still so bad with money that even though I was making more money, I just found a way to spend it. But if you are focusing on fixing your finances and trying not to be broke, and if that's what you're focusing on, then you'll probably do better with this than I did because I wasn't planning a budget. I wasn't seeing where all my money was going. I wasn't trying to cut back on my expenses. I wasn't trying to find cheaper alternatives to stuff. And even though I started making more money, I ended up spending it all because I wasn't focused on trying to get my expenses in order and trying to save money. But a couple things that you can do to try to make more money. What I did was I picked up an extra job. At one point in time, I was working doubles. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear this, but there were days that I would work like 16-hour days. I would start at 5 a.m. in the morning. I'd get off of the first job at 1, and then I would go in for another job at 3 and then work all the way to like midnight. As hard as I was working, I wish I would have saved a little bit more money, but I didn't. But that is something that you can do. You can see if your job will offer you overtime, pick up people's shifts. The better advice that I would give you is figure out how you can make yourself more valuable. Try to go out and learn a skill. Go look for a higher paying job. I know a lot of people will get a job and kind of stay at one of their first jobs for a very long time, even though the pay is not good, and they won't try to advance and look for other jobs. I remember when I was really young, I was about 19 years old. I was working at the water park in Las Vegas when I first moved there. I had a few options of the roles that I could have taken when I was working at that water park for a summer. And one of them was to be a lifeguard, but the lifeguards only made like $8 an hour. Instead, I took the job that paid like $1.50 more to be a pool tester. So I walked around the water park with a little box full of chemicals to test the pool water. And that's what I did. But I made a whole $1.50 more than the lifeguards did. It wasn't as glamorous of a job, but I made a little bit more money. And I always thought about making more money. Like I said, that was something I was good at, but I was terrible at saving money and I still spent it all. So just remember that if you do try to work more or increase your income somehow by making yourself more valuable or just working overtime or working 2 jobs, whatever, that if you don't try to be good with your money, you're still going to spend it all and you'll still be broke. A couple other things too to make more money is try to figure out some side hustles. I wish I would have thought about that stuff when I was in my 20s. I was not very goal oriented. I was not very focused on trying to improve my life or be better in any way. I was pretty much a degenerate who wanted to drink all day and party and play video games and do stupid stuff when I was in my early 20s. And I wish I would have thought about side hustles and how I could make more money. And I wish that I even just thought about that stuff a little bit more or attempted a side hustle or two or started my own, I don't know, whatever, car washing business or any stupid business that I could have thought of starting. I wish I would have, because I think that it would have helped me get ahead in different ways. And if your side hustle is successful, goal when you're young, then it could actually lead you to like financial freedom or becoming a business owner. And those are things that will help you get ahead later in life as well. So something you should think about. So once you've increased your income a little bit, another thing that you should work on is learning a little bit more about financial literacy. We're not taught about financial literacy in school. We're not taught about how to budget. We're not taught about how to fix our debt or build good debt and good credit. And we are not taught anything that will help us with this stuff unless your parents teach you. At least I know I wasn't taught any of this stuff in school. And it's things that I ended up learning as I got a little bit older and I wanted to get out of debt and I wanted to fix my credit. And it's something that I really recommend anyone of any age right now who's trying not to be broke is once you've kind of got a few of your things in order and you've got a budget and you're figuring out where your money's going and you cut back on your expenses and you're learning how to make more money or you're trying to make more money, take a little bit of time to watch some YouTube videos on basic financial literacy and learn about that stuff because it would really help you. I wish I would have learned about this stuff when I was younger, and it took me a while to start learning about it. The only reason I ended up learning about this stuff was because I was trying to get out of debt and I was trying to fix my credit. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is getting your debt in order and trying to figure that stuff out. Getting out of debt is like getting in shape. It's super easy to get fat and out of shape, and it's really hard to like eat good and work out and get in really good shape. And I would say that debt is the same way. Like it's super easy to ruin your credit and get in a whole bunch of debt. Like it's almost effortless, but it's really, really hard to get out of debt and get your credit in order. It took me a while to even want to do that stuff. I was much closer to 30 by the time I was trying to fix my credit and get out of debt and do all that stuff. But I wish I would have known some of the things that I ended up learning about that when I started trying to do it. Trying to get out of debt is tricky, especially when you're completely like financially illiterate. If you have no credit, then you're sitting in a better spot than people who have bad credit. But even with no credit, you're going to have to figure out how to like get good debt and have good credit and learn about revolving lines of credit and learn how to like manage your finances and having too much debt versus income ratio and stuff like that ends up hurting you. And you just don't know this stuff until you start trying to figure it out. But if you are trying to manage your debt and you are trying to get better credit, really take some time to learn about financial literacy and then start trying to work on those things. I remember my credit was really, really bad. So one of the things I did to start fixing my credit was that I got a secure credit card at my credit union. So basically a secure line of credit is where you put up your own money and then the bank gives you a credit card for that amount that you put up. At the time, my bank offered a $500 secure credit card and a $1,000 and a $1,500 one. And I started with the $500 one. And basically what I did was I got that to a 30% usage and I was just paying the monthly payment on that to start building good credit because I had bad credit. And since I had debt, what I did was I started paying off some of my high interest debt. And there was quite a bit of it, but it wasn't crazy. It was a few $1,000s. And that might seem like a lot of money, but in hindsight, it wasn't. I honestly paid it off pretty quickly once I started focusing on it. And I think that since I was really, really eager to fix my credit, put every extra dollar I had into that. And I stopped buying stupid stuff like I mentioned earlier. And I worked on trying to fix my credit and get out of debt. So that's something that you want to think about if you're trying to build your credit or if you have bad credit. You want to do things like secure credit cards. You want to pay off that high interest stuff. You also want to see if you can consolidate your credit. Sometimes you can get like a zero interest deal on a credit card that you might have. If you have okay credit, they might offer you that where you can like do a balance transfer and transfer over a lot of your existing lines of credit that may have like really high interest and put them on a zero interest plan for a year. Sometimes you can get like 18 months or even 24 months. If you do that, you usually pay a fee to transfer it, but many times, if you have a lot of debt and you can consolidate it, that fee ends up being a one-time thing that ends up being cheaper than paying the interest on all those other lines of credit. And then you have all your debt on one card that has no interest, and then you can focus on paying that off. You also want to do what they call like snowballing debt. When you start to snowball your debt and paying off things and trying to like focus all your payments on your lowest card and then move on to the second lowest, and then you kind of work up to your highest cards. That that way you can kind of pay them off. I do like the no interest approach, but you have to be careful because you want to make sure you pay it off, because if not, then you end up paying interest on it again. And many times what people who are bad with money will do is that they end up transferring that stuff and then they just get into more debt, and then that interest starts back up and then they're screwed. So you don't want to do that either. So just be careful with that. Another thing that my wife did, which was amazing, was that you can contact your creditors and you can try to get out of the payments. And if you're in collections, which I was in collections and my wife was in collections for some of the stuff when we were younger and we were trying to fix our debt, she called them and she negotiated with the creditors and got what she owed down to like way less. I think on one card that she owed, she ended up only having to pay 20% of what she owed. And it's crazy how much you can do by haggling and negotiating with creditors. Also, when you do it, make sure that you work out a deal where you tell them that it won't impact your credit and to like take it off of your credit, because they'll actually do that. I don't know if they still will, because of course this was a few years ago, but I know that at the time that my wife did it, if things haven't changed and you can still do that, I would totally go for that. And I would totally try to do that. And I recommend anyone trying to do that if you're trying to pay stuff off, is you tell them, hey, I don't want this to affect my credit. I'm going to pay you 20% or 30% of what I owe you in one lump sum, and we're going to call this good. You'll be surprised how many of these collectors and creditors will actually do that. Many of the times when you're in collections, those collectors have bought your debt for like pennies on the dollar, and they're trying to make money off of it. Sometimes offering them way less than you owe them, they kind of still make some money from it, and they'll be willing to work with you. Be careful though, because it gets tricky and I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but do your research and make sure that you come prepared so that you know what you're getting yourself into when you're trying to deal with creditors and collectors, because sometimes it can work out in your favor and sometimes you might screw yourself by making the wrong deal. So don't just take my advice, do some research on it. But I do suggest that if you are trying to pay stuff off, contact your creditors and see what they can do for you, because you'd be surprised they might be able to work with you. So once you've started like working on your debt and trying to fix your credit and all that stuff, I would definitely suggest an emergency fund. I almost suggest an emergency fund first, but I didn't mention it first because sometimes, especially when you're really young in your 20s, you've got a lot of help, right? When you're younger, many of us, when we're in our 20s, we live with our parents. And if an emergency comes up, usually we'll be okay. A lot of the times too, if you're in a ton of debt, it's almost impossible for you to save an emergency fund. And that's kind of why I didn't mention it before paying off the debt. I would say that once you've paid off your debt, or at least you have your debt consolidated and stuff's on 0% interest, you can start thinking about maybe saving a little bit for an emergency fund while you pay off your debt. But I almost say that if you're young enough and you can, focus on that debt, get rid of the debt first, because then you'll be able to save an emergency fund without having to worry about like, oh, I got to pay this month, or I got to pay that this month. Then you'll be able to focus on your debt first. And then all that money that was going to paying off your debt and fixing your credit can now be focused on like saving an emergency fund before you start then investing your money in other ways. But setting that emergency fund is critical. You really want the emergency fund because anything happens that might cost you $500 or $1,000, you don't want to have to go and use a credit card. You don't want to have to go and borrow money from someone. I forget the exact statistics, but I know it's something like 3 out of 4 Americans don't even have $1,000 for an emergency saved up. Pretty crazy to think, but it's the reality that many of us live. And I know when I was younger, I did not have any money saved up and I lived paycheck to paycheck and I was in debt. And finally, when I did start paying off my debt, I was able to save some money. And I do suggest that once you're able to start saving up a little bit of an emergency fund, this can be $500, this can be $1,000, it can be $1,500, but whatever makes you feel comfortable for a rainy day, for your car breaking down on you, or something crazy happening and you having to pay $500 because some shit just popped up. Like, you just want to be able to have a little bit of cash just in case. And once you have that $500 or $1,000 saved up, start to try to save up for 3 to 6 months. This is like a larger emergency fund. This is if I lose my job, I get sick, if I get hurt, if I broke my leg and I couldn't go to work, if anything happened where I needed to pay all of my bills for the next 3 to 6 months, How can I afford that? Well, you do that by saving up. So once you've saved up a small emergency fund that'll help you pay for a broken down car or a new tire if you get a flat, or something that isn't outrageous, then start thinking about saving that 3 to 6 month cushion for you to be able to survive if something bad happened and you needed to. Again, this is pretty ambitious for someone who's in their 20s, but if you start when you're young and you focus on this stuff, you're going to be so much further ahead. Like, I wish I would have started this stuff when I was 20 years old. Like everyone told me to. Everyone told me to fix my credit. Everyone told me to save money. Everyone told me to start investing. And when people explained compound interest to me, my eyes glazed over. But if you're watching this video, this means that you are at least interested or hoping to try to do this stuff, which I wasn't at the time. So you're already further along than I was, but it's just something to think about. If you're already thinking about this stuff, then you're doing pretty good. And don't worry, it takes a while to fix your credit. It takes a while to save up money. I would say that once you're in a spot where you've fixed your credit, you have no debt, and you have an emergency fund saved, and you're saving up for 3 to 6 months, at this point, I would say that you're not broke anymore. I would say it's safe to say that you're doing okay. Like I mentioned, it might take a while to do this. Be patient. I told someone that it took me like 10 years to fix my credit, to go from a 400 to an 800 credit score. And it probably took longer than that now that I really think about it. But most people think that this stuff happens quickly, but it doesn't, right? Because if you have terrible credit, it's going to take you a long time to move from 400 to 600. And then to get from 600 to 800, you're going to need a much higher income. You're probably going to need like some really good debt, like a mortgage, and you're going to need to like pay off a lot of stuff for that to climb up that high. But you're on your way if you've paid it all off and you've got some money in savings. At this point, like I said, you're not broke anymore. But the next steps that I would say in order to make sure that you don't go broke again is to keep doing some of these things. Don't spend money on stupid stuff, and think about your purchases. Sleep on it for a day or a week before you go out and buy stuff. Try not to buy stuff on credit. They say if you have to buy something on credit, you really can't afford it. So really, really think about those credit card purchases and try to avoid them. Try to make sure that you make debt work for you. Try to have good revolving lines of credit to improve your credit score, and try to not use that stuff unless you can get cashback bonuses and get points that you can use for airlines and stuff like that, and start thinking like an adult. But throughout this process, if you've gotten to this point, you've probably have done a lot of learning, and you've been able to do a lot more than most people are able to do. And what I would suggest is to continue to educate yourself more on finances. And then I would say start thinking about investing in a 401k if your employer offers it to you, or a Roth IRA. Start thinking about different ways that you can invest your money. Start thinking about different ways that you can make money. Really, compound interest is a crazy thing, especially if you're able to start investing when you're really young. The data's out there and it shows that a little bit of money every month can go a really long way once compound interest takes effect after 20 or 30 years. And people used to tell me this stuff when I was younger. And like I said, I didn't listen, and I wish I would have. Go out there and listen to the people who know what they're talking about, and try to make smart decisions with your money, and learn about how money works and how money can work for you. And once you're in a spot where you're no longer broke because you followed some of the steps that I mentioned in this video, you'll be in a much better position to think about your future and make better investments as you grow older. Then you can go on YouTube and try to tell the 20-year-olds out there in the future how they can save money and not be broke anymore. All right, with all that said, I think I'm going to wrap up this video. That's my tips and suggestions on how you can stop being broke if you're in your 20s. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, make sure you hit that like button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.